Hello and welcome back to another edition of the GSMC College Football Podcast, presented to you by the GSMC Sports Network. Happy Monday, everybody. Monday after draft day, got a lot of fallout. Got a good show to talk about, though. First, we're going to touch about the big surprise that happened. Shedeur Sanders falls all the way to not the second, not the third, not the fourth, but the fifth round, selected by the Cleveland Browns. Going to talk a little bit about that. Then we're going to talk a little bit about Shedeur even more. Going to talk about the prank calls that happened over the weekend and the fallout from that. Also going to touch a little bit about potential Super League incoming. Dabo Swinney seems to think it. We're going to talk about what the Clemson head coach said, get into some of that, what could potentially be happening in college football in the next 5-10 years. We're also going to talk about Quinn Ewers, his draft fall all the way to the 7th round. Should he have stayed at Texas? Possibly. Then make sure you stick around for my last segment. Going to go over some quarterback commitments, transfers, where they're landing, what the fit is like, and if it's a good move for them or not. But first, before I get into anything else, I just want to remind everyone that this show is all about you. We love hearing any comments, questions, insights you have. We want to make this show as interactive, as exciting, as fun as possible, and you are all a big part of that here at GSMC. We couldn't do what we do without your support. We're so grateful to have you as a part of our community. One great way to get involved, make sure your comment gets read on the air, is to use the Super Chat feature. To do that, you click the $ at the bottom of the chat box, type in your comment, question, opinion, hot take, whatever there. And this is a great way to ensure that your message gets on the air, and also just a great way to support our channel, support what we're doing here at GSMC. We're so grateful to have all of you here with us as a part of the GSMC community. Now, I want to talk a little bit about, not that, I did not do my segments right now. I want to talk a little bit about Shedeur Sanders, about the fallout here, what's going on. And this was really interesting. This was a guy that at one point in the draft process was a projected top 2 or 3 pick. The Browns, Giants, both quarterback needy teams needed a quarterback, but this is a guy that they passed on him in the first round. It was kind of surprising, though, that he lasted as long as he did throughout the day. One NFL wide receiver coach said that he's got a skill set, but no dominant trait. He called him a backup at this point and said that those guys kind of have to be wired for humble support of the starter. That's not what Shedeur Sanders is like. And then one of the knocks against his actual on-the-field skills is the sack number. Obviously, Colorado's line was a complete mess, complete disaster. He took like 90 sacks over the past 2 seasons. That's a lot of toll on your body. And it could also kind of show that maybe his processing isn't all the way there. He's also not super athletic. He can make plays. He can kind of extend a little bit, but he doesn't have that dominant athletic takeover ability. And also just arm strength overall. Just the overall strength of his arm isn't super great. Average at best, I would say. So those from the on-field perspective kind of were the knocks against Shedeur Sanders, right? But then there's also intel coming out. The same wide receiver coach said that he got intel from across the league, various sources, that Shedeur basically, the quote was, "This guy has no awareness about how he's coming across." And then also, I think he said something about leverage. It seemed like Shedeur Sanders felt that he had a little more leverage about where he was going, where he was going to end up, than actually was the case in the NFL. And then also didn't help Shedeur Sanders' stock that he did not compete in the Senior Bowl or the NFL Scouting Combine. He didn't do either. He did do his pro day, but pro days are historically really scripted. They're really conducive to quarterback play. Will Howard had a great pro day at Ohio State, but that's a situation where you're at your pro day, you're throwing to your own wide receivers, you know what throws you're going to have to make. Pretty much every throw is scripted, so it's a much more controllable environment than the NFL Combine, than the senior day, Senior Bowl. And also, if you're not a first-round pick, if you're injured, it's going to create some pause, some concern. And a former NFL quarterbacks coach, he was quoted that he said it wasn't super surprising that Shedeur Sanders waited as long as he did in the draft. But now the draft process is over. Shedeur Sanders, 144th overall pick. That's set in stone. Nothing's going to change. We're not going back in time. And Shedeur Sanders is not going to be a first-round pick. He's a fifth-rounder. That's just how it shook out. And this is a guy that he was the most talked about player in this class by far. I think from a combo of things, also just the pedigree that comes with being Deion Sanders' son, the attention level. I think that's a big part of this. But this guy was the most talked about player in this class, I would say. And then this is a guy that probably has one of the most memorable draft falls in NFL history, if not the most. Obviously, hindsight's going to be 2020. We're not going to know how Shedeur Sanders, how his NFL's career is going to shake out. But when you compare this to other memorable draft slides, you think of Aaron Rodgers, who was a projected number one overall pick at one point, slid to the 20s. Brady Quinn was another guy that had a draft day slide. Obviously, Dan Marino in 83. That was a pretty infamous quarterback slide. But all those guys were first-rounders. You had a little more recent ones. Will Levis, he was a second-round pick, projected top 10 throughout the draft process. But you really haven't seen a guy that was a top 5 pick slide all the way to the 5th round. And again, Shedeur Sanders, he was never involved in off-field incidents. He didn't get in trouble. He never got arrested, nothing like that. But his character was constantly criticized and kind of attacked by various media outlets, various inside sources, quote-unquote. And they cited a bunch of people that had been around this draft process that said, hey, this might not be super surprising if you actually see it. I talked a little bit about this last week on Friday, where The Athletic had surveyed 10 NFL coaches across the league and about whether they were surprised that Shedeur Sanders was not picked by the Steelers at 21. All 10 said no. So this was a thing that seems like the NFL was much lower on Shedeur Sanders than the media was. Anthony I said, I think the reason why Shedeur fell as far as he did is GMs and quarterback coaches don't want to be dealing. Yeah, I think that's a really big part of this. Everything that comes with Shedeur Sanders, it's a completely different package than really any quarterback prospect we've ever seen. You've seen guys like Eli Manning, obviously his dad was Archie Manning, had obviously had a great NFL career, but it's not Deion Sanders. Deion Sanders is one of the best all time. His presence throughout the media, just the personality, the everything that comes along with the Deion Sanders primetime experience. I agree. I don't think NFL coaches, GMs, really wanted to deal with that. But, at the same time, once he got to the 5th round, I think the value there was way too much for the Browns to pass up, even though they had taken a quarterback already in Dalen Gabriel with the 94th overall pick. But I think there is a little bit of bias here that has been kind of played into why Shedeur Sanders maybe fell. Because when you look at him from an on-field perspective as a quarterback prospect, this is a guy that, even if he might not have been a first-round prospect on a lot of teams' draft boards, he was a for sure day 2 pick, second-rounder, third-rounder at minimum. He's still a guy that's extremely accurate. He completed about 70% of his passes. Mobile, he's got a high motor, seems to have a high character from everything that we've heard from Colorado, from that kind of perspective, from guys that have played with him. But I think, would it have made the NFL look bad if he didn't get drafted at all? Completely. It would have been a really black eye for the NFL. I think it would have been a really bad look. And at some point, he needed to be drafted. I think I would have been really, really surprised if he went undrafted. At some point, I think he was going to be drafted, but I think also the confidence that comes with Shedeur Sanders, he's very similar to Deion in that aspect where he's extremely confident in his abilities, declared himself the best quarterback in the class multiple times throughout the process. And I think that probably kind of rubs some people the wrong way, too. You don't really see that much. Obviously, you see guys, Cam Ward, confident player. I think Shedeur, in the way that he might have presented himself, especially it seems like his interviews at the Combine kind of rubbed some teams the wrong way. They said he came off brash, kind of arrogant. I think some of his answers might not have been what NFL teams wanted to hear. And I think, they didn't want to deal with the media that's going to come with Shedeur. And that's what it sounded like. It kind of sounded like he was arrogant, kind of standoffish in his interviews. I wonder if he was trying to tank interviews potentially to maybe get drafted by a certain organization or team. I'm not sure. That's kind of just a theory that maybe I have, but I don't know. It does kind of seem, though, like every time he met with teams, he rubs somebody the wrong way in that interview process. And it's just kind of interesting. This whole scenario, we have never really seen a guy fall this far before in the draft, I think. Obviously, you have had some guys, like I said, Aaron Rodgers, Dan Marino, but those guys were still first-rounders. Will Levis more recently fell into the second, but not all the way to day 3. I think this had a lot more to do with off-the-field stuff, with teams maybe not wanting to have to do the whole Deion experience. That he's obviously going to be very vocal in Shedeur's career, what he has planned for his son, and he's going to be involved. The interview with Deion in the nightcap with Ocho Cinco, I kind of remember that. I don't remember all the details of that interview. I do remember, though, earlier in the process, there was a video that came out of Shedeur Sanders playing Madden, and he said that he only plays with the Browns. I thought that was kind of interesting because, maybe a little projection there. But this whole thing is going to be really interesting. I also think the fact that probably teams that were looking at him weren't looking at him as a day one starter right away. They were looking at him as more of a backup, developmental kind of quarterback. And if that's your situation, that's the scenario. This is a guy that has way too much media coverage and is just too much of a big name to kind of take over that role as a developmental backup guy. You're going to hear clamors for him to start. And I'm really curious to see how that quarterback competition is going to shake out in Cleveland. You have 4 quarterbacks on the roster now, traded for Kenny Pickett in the offseason, brought in Flacco, obviously drafted Dylan Gabriel, and now you have Shedeur. So you got 4 guys. I'm not really sure who's actually going to start, who's going to win that competition. Do you think people took some of the comments he made on that podcast interview out of context? I'm sure. I mean, that happens all the time, where, you get a 5 or 10 second soundbite, and it sounds a lot worse just in that little chunk compared to maybe what Deion had said for that whole minute or minute and a half he was talking. People are always going to try to get hot takes, sound bites, and that's something that's going to come with the territory, especially when you have a guy like Deion Sanders, just the high profile. But yeah, I think this is probably more of NFL teams did not kind of want to have to deal with, everything that comes with Shedeur, the whole package, the whole production company, and just Deion as his father, the vocalness of Deion Sanders. He's obviously highly outspoken. Could that have rubbed teams the wrong way? And maybe coaches, GMs thought that was a sign that there could be further tension down the road, or arguments, discussions with Deion and Shedeur Sanders that these teams didn't want to have. I think that's very possible. I think especially if you look at Steelers, Pittsburgh, it makes a lot of sense. Yeah, I'm going to talk about Quinn Ewers later on in the show. I am kind of surprised he fell that far, but I do have another segment where I'm talking about Quinn Ewers. I kind of like the pickup for Miami. I think he's a better quarterback than he's getting credit for right now. Phillip Rivers is an interesting comp. I hadn't really thought of that, but I could kind of see that just in terms of play style. But we are going to take our first break of the show right now. When we come back, we're going to talk a little bit about the prank calls that happened over the weekend. Obviously, still going to touch on Shedeur here, but want to just talk about the prank calls overall. That's a really interesting scenario. We're going to take our first break here on the GSMC College Football Podcast.